loudly, so I'm not sure that I need the microphone, but it helps people, so give it a shot. What the ICCRA does in terms of a lot of the science that we do. We spend quite a bit of time going out into the fields and examining the plants and doing all of those meter checks and all of that stuff. And a couple of years ago, as I was exploring the idea of the relationship between the Native American earthworks and the crop circles, and looking at these different features surrounding it in the context in which crop circles are coming down, it kind of struck me that, especially with the story I told last night about that there were Native American legends that may be associated with crop circles, or that Native Americans had certain practices that mimicked crop circles, that maybe we should be trying to take a look at crop circles from a completely different perspective. And perhaps we should be taking a look at crop circles from the context of the peoples that built these places thousands of years ago. And that there seems to be this direct relationship between, or a good correlation anyways, between where the Native American mounds are and the crop circles are coming down. And there seems to be some similarities between some of these things. So this is what led me to do this material that I'm going to present this morning. And I think that we as scientists and we as people in modern-day society have a very difficult time being able to accept the fact that other cultures may have known things that we don't today really have a concept of. And so what I try to do with this is to try and give people a sense of, if you were a Native American living a couple of thousand years ago, what are the symbols that they were using, and how would those perhaps relate to the crop circles? And so we're going to explore those kinds of relationships. All right? And again, yesterday I talked about these different sciences. I said, if we don't do this right here, then we can't get to making these determinations authentic and conclusive or man-made. So it's important, once we get to this point, that we can do the level 2 analysis and start looking at, the geometry and the symbols and the diatonic ratio analysis I mentioned last night. And so this is where we're headed, down the level 2 path, going in this direction. And these are the ones that we were looking at that we sort of made some determination already. And just to remind everybody, last night I talked about these relationships between these contextual details, the water, the power lines, down the hill slope, over the top of an aquifer, and then close to the Native American mounds and archaeological sites. So we're going to spend this talk talking all about this part of it. The greatest number of crop circles reported every year happen in southern England, and they have been for quite a number of years, at least for the last 20 to 30 years anyways. And the three counties that the crop circles seem to be coming down the most in are filled with an ancient landscape of earthworks. Places that people have heard, like Stonehenge, for instance, or Avebury, Silbury Hill, Barbary Castle. All of these places are ancient earthworks that are in the landscape. And it kind of struck me that Ohio has the most number of crop circles that have been reported in the United States. Well, Ohio's landscape is filled with ancient earthworks in a similar fashion. And so places like Sight Mound, and the Great Miamisburg Mound, and Serpent Mound, and places like that have a very close parallel to places in Europe where crop circles are coming down as well. So this here, for instance, is a photograph of the Bainbridge crop circle that was taken from the air, and of course it was right down the street from this mound structure here. But you'll notice in this photograph there appears to be another big ancient structure right outside of that island. We're still exploring that with some archaeologists. We've shown that to them. One has identified that as a change in the river channel. The problem with that is that it's like a complete circle. So we're still debating with some archaeologists about what that structure may be. But the gentleman that lives in this house, the landowner of the crop circle, that house, he was telling me that his grandfather built his house into an Indian mound that used to be right there. Back over 100 years ago or so, Route 50, right here, there was a train track that used to run there between Chillicothe and Hillsborough. And the railroad took out one half of the mound, and his grandfather built his house in the other half of the mound. And it wasn't a typical conical mound that you see in Ohio, but it was a pyramidal platform mound. So there are very few of those in the state of Ohio, but that happens to be one of them. And then I got an email from the guy that lives in this house right here, sent me an aerial photograph of that was taken back in the 1940s. And right adjacent to his house, just off the edge of the photograph, there was an enormous egg-shaped elliptical mound that used to be right there. Across the street, back in this field, according to the old archaeological maps, there used to be a square enclosure. So this whole valley was filled full of ancient earthworks. And so it's unsurprising that we might see some crop circles in these places. I made some references to some of the places in England, so let's do a little comparison, one for one. Silbury Hill in England, in Wiltshire County, is the largest man-made earthwork in Europe, tallest as well, like largest by volume. And of course, this mound here, the Miamisburg mound, is the largest man-made conical mound in Ohio. This is quite a bit taller than this. This is 68 feet high. This is 130 feet. They're similar in shape, and you can see some parallels there with the two kinds of forms. Now, I made this comparison at a conference in Arizona one time. It was being attended by a researcher from England, and she busted my chops about this comparison because Silbury Hill, in actuality, was not just a straight conical mound, but it was actually a stepped mound. It was kind of like a stepped pyramid, essentially, and it has sort of kind of grown over time to become more conical shaped. Of course, these were not built. This was not built in that sense. But there were conical stepped pyramids here in North America. And I'll just show you one really quick. This is a place down in Mexico, way on the coast of Mexico, a place called Jalisco, last year, or 2 years ago, became the newest World Heritage Site that was named for these circular stepped pyramids. And these are constructed in a very similar fashion to how Silbury Hill was constructed. And back in 2006, I got a report that there were some randomly down type events of flattened crop circles near this area. And right adjacent to this area, I did some research and I came across that there was this unusual set of petroglyphs nearby where the crop circles are coming down, nearby where this is, that the archaeologists were really puzzling over because they don't look like anything else in Mexico. But of course, this is an interesting sort of shape if you were a crop circle researcher, because these are what they used to call dumbbell-shaped formations, a similar kind of symbolical shape. So just figured I'd throw that in. Now, in 2004, there was a large crop circle formation that came down in the field closest to the Miamisburg Mound. And the following year, there was a crop circle formation of a similar pattern that came down near Silbury Hill. And what's interesting about this is that both, when I looked at these, both of them seem to be aligned along the edge of the mound and not through the center. Now, this was an aerial photograph taken by Ted Robertson, and I came to learn that it is off just slightly from where we think this is pointing here. And I'll show you that later on. There's something interesting going on with the orientation to that particular crop circle to Miamisburg Mound. There are places like Stonehenge. Most people are familiar with the stones at Stonehenge, but don't understand that it's actually much of a larger earthwork that's there. It was actually a whole complex of earthworks, ditch and parallel pathways and all kinds of additional mounds. But of course, I mentioned yesterday Gerald Hawkins' work about the astronomical alignments at Stonehenge that he uncovered back in the 60s. There are astronomical alignments at Serpent Mound. And so there are some interesting parallels between these ceremonial structures. Of course, in England, you have Avebury's Circle, which is one of the largest earthwork circles in the world. And here in Ohio, up in Newark, is a circle nearly the same distance. This is only about 100 feet wider than this one is. The ditch in the wall on this is quite a bit taller than this, but still you have a ditch and a wall. This has a little extension coming out in this direction. But very similar types of structures being built. Now, of course, Newark was interesting because that wasn't the only part of that, but we'll talk about Silbury first, or Avebury first. Avebury, this is an old diagram that was done by William Stuckley in the late 1700s, I believe, that showed that there were avenues of stones that were placed leading to and from Avebury's Circle, and there were circles of stones in the interior, and that this led to a circle of stones on the top of this hill called Halfpen Hill. Halfpen is an interesting old English word that meant head of the serpent. And Stuckley's idea was that Avebury was not just this old ancient earthwork circle, but that it was a serpent complex. And so that's kind of interesting. Here in Ohio, just to the southeast of here, another similar type of structure was built, a place called Portsmouth, Ohio, that led to a circle with a couple of interesting horseshoe shapes in the middle of it, then led to another place on the top of a hill, another kind of concentric circular earthwork. And so there are some interesting parallels. Is this what we would consider to be the Great Ohio Serpent? As Stuckley says, this is the Great Avebury Serpent. And I'll talk a little bit more about this serpent structure later on. I mentioned Newark. Newark, the circle that we looked at is this one here. This was an old map from the 1860s that was done by David Wyrick. of the entire complex of earthworks in the city of Newark, most of which are gone today, except for that circle and this big structure here, which is this, a huge circle connected by an avenue to a giant octagon. And you'll notice there is an 18-hole golf course in the middle of it now. What's interesting to note is right here, there is a little circle off to the edge. They don't really show it on this map, but yeah, it's kind of like right here. There's a circle off to the side of the octagon with a little putting green inside of that. That is the size of the stone ring at Stonehenge. So that'll give you some sense of scale of the size of the structure. It is enormous. And that is just one piece of this whole entire complex. And there's all kinds of interesting things about the Newark earthworks that we don't have time to get into. One last thing I'll say is that, see this little pathway here that leads away? There is some idea that that pathway led to Chillicothe and connected up with another circle connected to an octagon that was oriented opposite this one at 90 degrees. And that pathway ran about 60 miles straight, and maybe known as the Great Hopewell Road. And that these were actually mound pathways. So it was like a road constructed with mounds on either side as a ceremonial pathway that people would travel back and forth to in between these ceremonial structures. So this is an interesting complex. So we have an ancient landscape here in Ohio, much like the ancient landscape in England. Now, of course, in Chillicothe, there's this mound city, which is a big square filled with a bunch of earthwork mounds. In Europe, there are a whole number of these type squares, earthwork mounds, associated with Celtic culture in places all across Germany, where they're having a number of crop circles as well. Just up the road here is a place known as Fort Hill, which was believed to be constructed by the Hopewell, which takes up the entire length of the top of the hill. And this is a wall that was built out of earth and stone. Well, it's not unlike a lot of the hill forts in England. This is a picture of Barbary Castle. You can see a crop circle in the field right below there. These are constructed in similar time frames. This is around 500 BC. This is around 100 BC. So we're seeing similar structures being constructed in the same places where crop circles are happening. Now, a few years ago, we got notified of a crop circle up in the state of Wisconsin. I want to talk a little bit about this crop circle for a number of reasons. But the reason that we went to go see this, that would have been way, way far for us to go look at a crop circle. But this particular crop circle was eyewitnessed by a person, and eyewitness crop circles don't happen very often. So it's kind of important to go and try and track them down. And so this happened in between, or located near two towns called Mayville and Kokoski. It happened on the 4th of July in the year 2003. And on the morning of the 4th of July, this eyewitness was named Art Rentella. He was a retired truck driver in his early 60s. He was used to getting up very early in the morning, was ordinarily getting up at 5 o'clock to drive his truck, so he was waking up early in the morning, and he turned his TV on, and he's something of a weather aficionado. He likes to watch the Weather Channel and watch the weather storms and stuff like that come through the area. Noticed that there was a storm that was heading across Wisconsin that was going to be going over his area. And so he decided that he would go out to his workshop and he would make some coffee and he would wait for the storm to go by so he could watch the storm. So there he was, and I actually took this picture out of the workshop window where he was sitting and looking at this tree. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of damage to the tree. When the storm arrived, the first thing that he noticed was that the wind was pretty severe and it started to blow the bark off the tree. And so that got his attention, and he looked out the window and he's watching the bark come off the tree. He then caught his attention, and he looked across the street. And across the street, there's a house and a grove of trees, and he was watching the trees start to kind of sway violently back and forth, and that directed his gaze to the wheat field across the street where the crop circle occurred. So this is the view out Art Mantella's workshop window, and that's where the crop circle occurred. Now it occurred on a facing hill, so you had a pretty good view of it. This is where Art Mantella lives. This is the grove of trees across the street. And so he watched as this crop circle went down first, then this crop circle went down second, and then this crop circle went down third in that amount of time. It took me to say that. About 12 seconds. He watched all three of them go down, and he described the wheat sort of swaying in the wind. You may be familiar with the phrase amber waves of grain from the famous song. The waves of the wheat waving back and forth, and then as he described it, it was as if dark holes just opened up in the field because they were in shadow. And so he just sort of watched this hole open up, and then a second one, then a third one. And he saw no unusual lights. He saw heard no unusual sounds, no UFOs, just this storm front passing. Now what's important about this particular eyewitness case is it's a little different from most of the eyewitness cases in the sense that this is the first eyewitness case of a geometric crop circle formation occurring. Most of the eyewitness cases that have been documented have been of simple circles by themselves. But this is the first one where somebody actually watched what we would call a pictogram go down. And the only thing that he didn't really see was that there was a pathway that connected these two circles that was part of the formation, and he couldn't actually see that pathway go down. He did watch the three circles go down. And it continued raining until about 11 o'clock in the morning, in which by that time he went over to his neighbor's house. You can see the driveway right here. Went to his neighbor's house who owns this field, and they went out into the crop circle to take a look at it. So it wasn't too long after that it hit the media, and we heard about it, and we went up to talk to Art Mantella.
All right, so it came down before the rain?
As the front was passing. So the rain was already, they had already...
There's wind that precedes the rain.
Yes.
This is in the windy period.
Well, I believe it had started to rain as it was going past.
Lightning?
No, didn't describe any lightning.
Yeah. Well, didn't they say that it was a tornado south? That's part of why he was interested in being out there to see.
Well, it was a severe storm. Whether or not it was a tornado cell, and I did not spawn any tornadoes that made it on record, so not that I know of. Now, that storm front that passed over our Mantella's house made it across Michigan and continued to intensify. And in fact, that morning, Chuck Lietzau invited me to speak at the National MUFON Convention, which was being held in Dearborn, Michigan. And so I was actually there giving my talk about the time that this occurred. And the storm was so intense that the power was going out in the area and things like that. And it was only later on that we sort of put the two and two together that this was going on simultaneously to when I was giving my lecture there. So that's kind of an interesting thing. All right, so here again, here's the view from Art Mantella's window. You can see the power lines here. It's on the downslope of the hill. This tree line back here is where the creek is. It sits right over the top of a limestone aquifer. So we have all of the sort of contextual components in place. We did go out there and we authenticated this crop circle formation using the LME process. There were some other anomalies present. And, yeah.
You said that you saw dark holes open.
That's how he described it, but it was the shadow of the circle opening up in the wheat.
I believe that he said that at the time the heads of the wheat were starting to get gold, but the stalks were still green. And then this is dawn to begin with.
Yeah, so it was early in the day, so it was just a very dark shadow that opened up. So So there's Art Mantella, and there's Roger and I interviewing him. One of the interesting anomalies that we found were some stalks of wheat that the very tips of it that were curled around as something, spun the tops of the wheat around. There was a lot of random damage in the field. This pathway was made by visitors, this pathway was made by visitors, this pathway was made by visitors. This one was made by a visitor, this one was made by a visitor. The rest of it was all, this one was made by a visitor, but all the rest of this was down. This was part of the formation, the crescent, and the circle there. There were expulsion cavities, or what we call blown node collars. It was tested positive for LME for node elongation, as I mentioned. One interesting thing that Roger did was he took his little pen magnet and he touched his magnet to the soil, and the soil kind of clumped around it. Then we went outside the crop circle and tried the same thing, and it didn't do that. So that kind of indicated there was a lot of magnetic material that had been deposited in there, or somehow was induced magnetism to be able to do that. So that was kind of an interesting little piece. Yeah.
Just as a scientific note, we did that in 12 places so that we could do a statistical analysis.
Right.
Okay.
We sent the dimensions of this to a couple of researchers, one D. Gregg down in Mexico, and he found 2 additional geometric theorems that had not been found previously by Euclid or by Hawkins and him looking at crop circles. And he found those through trigonometric means, which is an interesting way of doing it. And then I sent it off to Bert Jansen, a geometry researcher of crop circles in the Netherlands, and he found that the crop circles are not just sort of placed at random, but they seem to correspond to this hidden underlying eightfold geometry, which is pretty interesting, as well as the other geometry being present. Of course, while we were there, the military arrived. I don't really want to get into much of this story because it's not really part of this talk. But the one interesting thing of note was that when the helicopter was overhead, I took a series of photographs on there, and as well as everybody else who was there was taking photographs of the helicopter overhead. But I had a polarizing lens on my camera, and I seem to be the only one that took these series of photographs, which seems to show something that's flying around the helicopter. Now, what's interesting to note is that that didn't appear on anybody else's photographs, but I was the only one that had this polarizer, so it may have been something that my polarizing lens was able to discern by shooting up in the sky. So that may be a type of a ball of light. And this has been reported by researchers in England, where they filmed military helicopters with balls of light kind of flying around them while they were hovering over crop circles. So that's kind of an interesting little thing. So I don't want to get into the other story because that's going to take a while. But this is the context in which that particular crop circle came down. Here is where the Mayville crop circle went down. And there's a lot of other interesting stuff in the area, some of which we're going to talk about, some of which I don't have time to talk about. But what I will say is that in the process of my researching different places around here, one of the most recent of the kind of discoveries of the Native American mound sites in the area came out of an article written by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Peet in the late 1800s. And he went up to Mayville, Wisconsin, which was a place that had previously been known to having a lot of effigy mound structures around it. An effigy mound being a mound shaped into an animal of some kind. And he wrote about a serpent mound in Mayville, Wisconsin. And I was able to finally track down the location of it this year. And it turns out to be about 3/4 of a mile away from where the crop circle occurred. Now, that's kind of interesting for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that as we go along, but it'll dawn on you what the significance of that is. But I'm going to talk about a couple of other close areas. I'm going to talk about the Coulterman Mound site and the Manitou petriform there, and the Nietzsche mounds and the lizard mounds, and some of these other sites as we go along. So the formation comes down, and it comes down in between three major mound sites. One is called the Lizard Mound Park, one is called the Nietzsche Mound Group, and the third one is called the Coulterman Mound Group. Now the Lizard Mound Park, and this is a sort of a schematic of what's in the park today, has 28 different effigy mounds in it, which are preserved out of an original number of about 60 or so. The rest of them have been destroyed by farms on either side. And you'll notice that there are a number of forms in here. Panther effigy, bird effigies, some conical mounds, a number of interesting mounds there. And this place where all of these mounds occurred was the presence of a number of sacred springs that provide the headwaters for the Milwaukee River. So that's at the Lizard Mound Park. Now on the opposite side of where the crop circle came down is this place called the Nietzsche Mound Group. And this is actually two mound groupings of about 62 effigy mounds. This is a schematic of the park there, of all the effigy mounds that are located on the grounds there. There are two flowing springs on that site, and in the middle of all of these effigy mounds, this stone right here. Those with a good imagination, what might that look like to you? Anybody? Here's your chance at a Rorschach test.
It's a dancing lady.
Okay, there's one interpretation. Anybody else? What is it?
It's a buffalo.
Yeah. This is the back of the buffalo right there. The Native Americans used to create and shape stones into effigies of animals, and they called them Manitou stones. And there are several examples of buffalo Manitou stones, and this appears to be one of them. This is completely surrounded by the effigies in about this area of the park. So it's kind of an interesting little stone there. Now, one of the things I will say is you'll notice that there are these really long-tailed effigies. And the long tails of the effigies seem to be indicating that they were water spirit symbols, water animals of the lower world or the underworld. And I'll talk about that a little more as we go on. But you'll see these in some of these effigy mounds, and they have some importance to us. Oh, I will mention that before, well, about the time that the crop circle went down and we traveled up there, I wrote a report that talked about this mound group, and because I kind of discovered it out in this farm field at the time. You know, it had been known, but it hadn't been very well publicized that it was there. And so when I wrote about this effigy mound group in my report, which was pretty widely read up there, the local town council got together and, along with the county, and they bought this property to preserve the effigy mounds, and they made this park after the crop circles came down. So this is kind of an interesting thing. This is a brand new park that just was to build, you know, kind of bought to preserve those mounds that are there. Now, I mentioned the sort of underworld creatures. So let's talk about the ideas that the mound builders had. What was their cosmology? How did they see the world? And I think it's important for us to understand this before we go any further. The peoples that built the mounds, there are several different cultures that built them. They built them over time, over several thousands of years. But one of the things that seems to be relatively common was the cosmology and how they saw the world and the universe. Today, you know, we understand that, you know, we're on the planet Earth, and the planet Earth is spinning around the sun, and there's space out there and stars and all that kind of stuff. But of course, earlier peoples didn't really believe that, and they interpret the world in their own way. And their way of understanding how the world worked was that we live on the Earth's surface here. That was sort of one plane of existence. But there was kind of two other planes of existence. And so you have the path of the sun going around this way, that they quartered the sort of sky into four pieces: north, south, east, and west. And this idea of quartering time and space was really important to these peoples. But then there was the space that went up and the space that went below this quartering. And so as the sun went around, they tried to understand what could be above and what could be below and what would be responsible for that. And so they understood that the sky upper world was ruled by the Thunderbird, and that there was a water underworld that was ruled by the great horned serpent, which had sort of a dual kind of connotation, or the underwater panther. Those two aspects are relatively identical in this mythology. The great horned serpent, underwater panther. It's those two ideas. And so this actually comes to us from the Hopewell site in Chillicothe. This is sort of their representation of the serpent with the horn. And we'll see some of that as we go along. So these two ideas, the Thunderbird and the great horned serpent. Now, when the mound builders built and constructed their mounds, there was a great difference in how they saw the function of what the mounds were and what their purpose was. There was a distinct difference between those two concepts. And it's important for us to realize that today. So, for instance, the function was considered to be profane, not talked about. It was not really, the importance of the site. An example would be mound sites or medicine wheels as being calendrical sites. Serpent Mound, for instance, is all kinds of astronomical alignments dedicated to the rising and setting of the sun and the moon at certain times of the year, considered to be marking out the calendar or certain important dates of the year. That wasn't its purpose. That was a function of the site, but not its purpose. Its purpose was considered to be profound, and that was that the site was to help them to seek and maintain universal order on behalf of mankind. So, for instance, the idea here, and this is sort of an idea that's come to us, is a viewer who observes an equinox or a solstice is said to become the cosmic center of the universe, pinning the sky and the earth together with the four directions, becoming a symbolic witness to the actual first moment of creation. And that this precise point in time when that occurs is considered to be a singularity. And that is a direct translation from the original Indian word, a singularity. Now, for those physicists in the room, a singularity is what? Gene?
Point of the quantum, or the zero-point energy.
Yeah, zero-point energy or quantum, the initial state of being, singularity.
That's why I was asking about the black holes.
Right. All right. So with that in mind, the difference between site's function and its purpose, and whether or not there's a difference between the two, let's go over to one of the mound sites near where that crop circle occurred, a place called the Coulterman Mound Group at Petriform. Now when Roger and Chuck and I arrived there, we looked at the crop circle and they got to know us a little bit, some of the locals there. One of the locals, Gary Collimer, I was saying that I used to teach physics and astronomy while I was there at Eastern Michigan University. Said, oh, you're interested in astronomy? There is a site near here of some mounds, some ancient mounds that there's one archaeologist that believes that there's some, astronomical connotation to it. I'll take you up to see it. So he drives us up there, and this is it. And we were like, there was a sign on the side of the road that said effigy mounds, and it gave it sort of a rough date estimate of when they believed it would be built. That's it. There's no There's no anything else about it. It's sort of on private property. And they got permission to let us go on the property to look at it. And so it's just these little low mounds that don't really amount or look at like much. And to be honest with you, we all completely forgot about it. I didn't even write this, my own group, up in the report. We didn't really know much about it. There wasn't a lot of local information about it. And it wasn't until last year I sort of re-stumbled upon this site while I was doing some mapping of some of the mound sites and the crop circles in Wisconsin. I was doing sort of a project on Google, mapping these things out, and I came across this reference to the Coulterman Mound Group up in Dodge County where the crop circle came down, and I was like, I hadn't heard of that one. You know, what's that all about? So I started to do some searching about the Coulterman Mound Group, and the only thing I could find was a single reference of a paper that had been written by an author by the name of Herman Bender. So I wrote to Herman Bender, and I said, you know, I was up there a couple of years ago, and somebody took me up to see this site, and you know, I don't really know much about it. Do you know anything about it? Can you tell me more about it? And so he sent me this paper that just completely changed my view of what I was going to talk about at last year's conference. And for those of you who are here, I sort of did this version of this talk last year. And what he showed me about this site is just incredible to believe. And it really makes some interesting sense when compared with the crop circle. One of the things that he talked about that is there at this site is that there is a series of stones laid out in the landscape that's known as a petroform. And that they're specifically laid out in terms of a kind of a structure. And that these mounds were one of the first, earliest archaeological sites in Wisconsin that was carbon dated. This was carbon dated to about 8770. But that they believe that the petroform predated the mounds because the petroform is actually underneath the mounds, and underneath some of the mounds. So the petroform seems to have predated the thing. Now, I mentioned the buffalo stone at the other effigy mound site nearby. Here is another buffalo-shaped stone that appeared at the Coulterman Mound site. Herman Bender did this diagram showing the relationship of the buffalo there. Herman Bender is the president of the Hannah Watkins Center for Prehistoric Astronomy, Cosmology, and Landscape Studies, and he discovered and recorded this Coulterman petroform. And so several of the stones are these buffalo effigy Manitou stones. One in particular is aligned with summer solstice sunrise. And that term, Manitou, is an Algonquin word for spirit or presence or supernatural power. It's the great spirit that is in all things. And that Manitou was particularly recognized to be present in unusual objects with unusual shapes in unusual settings. Like these buffalo-type stones, or the buffalo stone I showed earlier. And so some Native Americans used to actually carry around shaped stones, portable Manitou stones. This is one in the image of a Thunderbird. But there were stones with strong Manitou, or that spirit that was embedded within that. They were intentionally placed on high points associated with water. Springs, river headwaters, rapids, waterfalls, river bends, creeks, drainage, divides, and all those kinds of places. And that these stones served as trail shrines along Indian trail pathways. These stones were associated with unusual natural sounds or sound projections coming off of the hillsides or rocks or stones, and that they produced what are known as auditory illusions, or that sounds seem to be manifesting from within the rocks themselves. There are a couple of places here in Ohio that have this auditory illusion. There is a pretty good site over in the Hocking Hills area that you can talk at the wall, and it sounds like the sound becomes amplified in that surrounds you. It's an auditory illusion type of a place. So there the most favored of these stones were red-colored rocks or iron-bearing rocks, and that sometimes they painted the stones red if they weren't made of iron. The most common of these stones were effigy shapes. They were called image stones by Henry Schoolcraft, who I mentioned yesterday, the ethnologist who recorded that story about the magic circle in the prairie. Portable stones could be carried around as a talisman. There's this one here. And I mentioned that the Manitou is an Algonquin word for spirit. The Iroquois had a similar concept. They called it the Orenda or the Aki. The Sioux and the Lakota called it Wakin. These were all similar concepts for the same idea. Now, one of the Coulterman petriform stones has a petroglyph on it, and it's a petroglyph of a thunderbird. And in Plains tribes, a lot of the Lakota and Dakota tribes, the thunderbird is known as the Wakinian. And that root word you can see there, well, the Dakota word Kinian means wing, but the root lies in Wakan or Wakan, this idea of the spirit. So roughly translated, it means sort of great spirit. But so one of the stones had this thunderbird image on it. So the thunderbird is kind of considered to be the Thunderers, Star Being, or the Wakinians. All sort of meant the same thing. Now, just as sort of an aside, in 2006, there was a crop circle that came down in sorghum Sudan grass in Kansas, near Beloit, Kansas, in the early morning after it had been raining all night. And this particular circle, you can see this was taken early in the morning by the neighbor who lived next door. There were no tracks leading into it. There are no tram lines in the field. Ted Robertson and his name just escapes me off the top of my head. Another member that we met last year of the ICCRA went out to this site, and they examined it, and they were able to collect samples from it. But what was interesting about this site is that right up the road, there was a historical marker that notes the location of Wakanda, or the Great Spirit Spring. Now, what's interesting about that site is that this is a photograph that was taken in the late 1800s by the Kansas Geological Survey. And this was a huge hole in the ground that went down into the ground some pretty good distance, at least 115 feet when it was measured in the 1960s. And it was a saltwater spring. And this was a place that Native Americans came from states away to come to this place. And it was, you can see it's on the top of this sort of rock mound here. And so this is what is right up the road from where the crop circle occurred. Now, Wakanda Springs for centuries, both Indians and when white people arrived, it was something of a source of wonder. And it's this sort of deep-seated spring that's in the shale overlying the sandstone there. Now, the Plains Indians regarded springs as being the dwelling place of supernatural powers. Remember, I talked about the mound builder cosmology. There is the Thunderbirds that rule the sky upper world. What rules the underworld? Pay attention. What's that? Yes, the underwater panther or the great horned serpent. They would live in these places under the earth and the water, so that water was associated with those places. And so they came to places like this. And there were about a dozen holy springs that were known to whites in and around this area. So Wakanda Springs was thought to mark the location of an underwater lodge where many of these supernatural animals gathered and held council. And this spring never froze in the wintertime. It's dark blue water, salt water, and rain or drought never affected it. It just seemed to always, water always came up there, but that the water seemed to rise and fall with ocean tides, which was kind of interesting. Now, again, this is another historical photograph of people going out to the spring. In the late 1800s, there was a little hotel built there And it lasted up until into the 1940s. And in the 1940s, the federal government got the great idea to dam up the local river and flood this area, just like I talked about yesterday in Tennessee. And so this now lies at the bottom of the lake, just like the other places in Tennessee, in the Cherokee country. And there was a local member of the local Geological Society in Kansas who fought tooth and nail against this because he knew how important the spring was, not just to the local Indians, but geologically it was really interesting. And the federal government just said it was some kind of mud hole, it was no big deal. And so they constructed the dam and they flooded it. And compounding that, they dismantled these buildings here and they threw all the debris down into the holes. So not much left. In 1970, after the dam was constructed, the waters closed over. Now, interestingly enough, the locals have built a facsimile of this on the shore of the lake. They have tried to reconstruct a sort of fake version of the Wakanda Spring some distance away from where this actually occurred. So that's kind of interesting that they wanted to keep it around. So that was sort of a diversion, but we talk about Wakan and Wakanda Springs. That's where the root of that comes from. I just want to go that direction. Now back to the Coulterman Mound group. This is the stone figure or the petroform that exists there. It's known as the star being, and the reason it's known as the star being, well, a couple of reasons. Herman Bender took this form out to a number of different tribes, tribal leaders and medicine men, and said, you know, what does this look like? What is this? He researched what's this form and what's this shape. And it turns out that the best information he was able to get was from the Lakota. The Lakota are well known for having retained much of their ancient star knowledge, how they connected the stars in the sky to create their own constellations. We know constellations today as sort of little lines connecting stars to make pictures up in the sky, and most of those come to us from Western civilization, Western culture, places of Greek constellations and things like that. But of course, other cultures around the world connected the dots differently. And the Native American tribes connected the dots differently. And in this case, this seems to have been the way that they connected the dots, was to create this particular figure. And this is actually made up of the modern day constellations of Libra and Scorpius. And so this is an actual layout of Libra and Scorpius in the landscape made up of these stones. And what's really interesting is that, I'll show you the two side by side, it seems to be a mirror image of the constellations. Here is Libra and Scorpius, and this is Mars, because Mars travels through this every 2 years. And they have it here. Now what's interesting is they got the colors of the stones correct. That the colors of the stars match the colors of the stones on the ground. So they have seemingly reproduced this, and so that's really interesting. Now, the Lakota and other tribes refer to this figure as the star being or the star man, and that he is the herald for the Thunderbird constellation, or the herald of the Thunderbirds. And so he's considered to be the harbinger of the return of the Thunderbirds. That every spring this constellation comes up in around March and is there from beginning of March through April into May, and is at the highest point of the sky during that time when the storms come back. The storms are associated with the Thunderbirds and the return of the Thunderbirds. So we have this connection between the star man and the star people, the return of spring, and the return of the Thunderbirds and the Thunder beings. Now, Scorpius is sort of got this relationship both literally and symbolically to the constellation of Orion, which reenacts the movement of the Thunderbirds in the sky in Native American cosmology. And that the Thunderbird constellation here sort of moves south during the summertime, and then Orion sort of acts as the slayer to vanquish the horned serpent, as the mythology goes, because the Thunderbird is the only one that can kill the great horned serpent with his lightning. And then the Native Americans held renewal ceremonies, these birth renewal ceremonies, in association with this sort of movement of the sky. And that, well, I mentioned the asterism and the various tribal orders relating to this figure. Now the Pawnee, which is another Plains tribe, saw the stars of Scorpius as the real snake, and that the real snake heralded the Thunderer's return, and that these constellations acted as a way to quarter time and space, and that it connected the earth and the sky together, connected the star people, the return of the spring. So what's interesting is that the headstone of the Coulterman mound group makes up the petriform, has been placed in a landscape where Mars passes through Scorpius and Libra, and this is a red stone. Now, when we were there, I remarked that, is anybody a fan of Richard Hoagland in the room? A couple people. Who knows who Richard Hoagland is? Okay. He's the guy that wrote the book on the face on Mars, right? I don't know if you've seen the photographs or the pictures of the face on Mars that he has come up with, but this just kind of struck me as sort of one of those Rorschach test kind of things, that this sort of looked like it in profile, and like the profile photos that he had put together of the 3D shading information that he got. But that's just sort of a side, sort of that interesting little Mars connection there. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of the Thunderbirds, because we haven't really delved into that at this point. But I should mention that a lot of that star information came from the tribes in the Plains states, the Pawnee and the Lakota and the Dakota. And those Sioux tribes actually came from Wisconsin. They were sort of driven out of Wisconsin at one point. And so where this Coulterman Mound Group is and where this crop circle is, of course, is in Wisconsin. And so those peoples managed to retain that information from earlier times from being in Wisconsin. But also in Wisconsin, there are groups of tribes, one which is the Ojibwa, and they have certain groups within their tribes, sort of a secret society, so to speak. They have sort of levels. They call it the Grand Medicine Society, also known as the Midewiwin. The Midewiwin considered the Thunderbird to be a messenger to the spirit world. And according to one of the Plains medicine men, a guy by the name of Lame Deer, and there are other older myths that support this, there were always 4 Thunderbirds. There are always 4. And that the Thunderbirds live in the 4 quarters of the sky, 4 different directions. And that the Thunderbirds are the messengers of the 4 winds. And while all things in nature seem to move clockwise, the Thunderbirds always move counterclockwise. And this is an interesting picture. This is a Thunderbird whorl. What some of the Native Americans would do with this one actually comes from some of the Pacific state tribes, somewhere out in Oregon, I believe, is that they used to make these discs with pictures of the Thunderbirds on it, and they would put a string through the center, and they would wind the string, and then they would spin it, like that. Now, for those who were here last night and saw my talk and me describing the crop circle formation at Paulding, Ohio, one of the things that you notice is that there appears to be in many crop circles this sort of hourglass shape effect. And this seems to be depicted in this sort of spinning whorl of the Thunderbirds going by. It's that the effect that we see on the ground of crop circles going by, which we know is just a product of the different reflection of light from the way that the wheat has been swirled down, seems to reproduce this exact same effect that the Native Americans were doing using this Thunderbird imagery. And the Thunderbird is what Carl Jung would say is an archetype. The this is something that appears in many, many cultures around the world. So Thunderbird is sort of at the root core of a lot of our cultural heritage. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about this particular crop circle because Chuck Lietzau is going to spend some time today talking about this, but since I mentioned the name Carl Jung, I wanted to mention this particular crop circle, which came down near the crop circle that we have been talking about up in Mayville, Pecoski. This is south of there in the same county. And so there was another crop circle down below there. This is the town of Kleinman in Wisconsin, population 700. And I happened to spot this particular crop circle on one of our trips up to visit Art Rentella. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll let Chuck describe that. There's a sort of a bigger image of the crop circle there in the field. Nearby where this particular crop circle came down, this past year when I went up to speak at the Hanwakin Center for Prehistoric Astronomy, just due west of the Kleinman Formation, I just found out this past August, there was a gentleman who came to the conference there at the Hanwakin Center who was a local farmer near Kleinman, just to the west of Kleinman. And he said, you got to come out to my place. He invited everybody to the conference. You got to come out to my place. I think that I have petroforms on my property. And nobody paid any attention to this guy, but after every talk, this guy in his big overalls said, come on out, we'll have a corn festival, we'll grow some corn, the corn's ripe, you know, come on out and we can take a look at these petroforms. And nobody was listening to him, but I talked to him for a while, and he talked about his petroforms, and we decided collectively that we would change our schedule of our trip to go out and visit him. And when we decided to go out there, then some of the other people at the conference decided to go out there, including Herman Bender, the archaeologist I was talking about who discovered the Culturman petroform. And we went out there, and this guy has some amazing petroforms on his property. He has a serpent petroform, he has a bear paw petroform, he has a turtle petroform, and a number of other petroforms that we have yet to map out. So he's got a whole series of these on his property right by where the Kleinman crop circle came down. So I just wanted to briefly mention that. So what is this Thunderbird serpent connection? Let's talk about that for a bit. The existence of the Thunderbird tradition among the Ojibwas was confirmed in the 1800s by Mississauga Indian, and that the Ojibwa in the Chippewa tradition about this said that they considered the thunder to be a god in the shape of a great eagle that feeds upon serpents, which takes it from under the earth. And this guy, Peter Jones, also relates the story of an Indian who visited the nest of a thunderbird up on a high mountain, saw the bones of serpents scattered around, and noticed that the bark of young trees had been peeled off by the young thunders trying their arrows before going abroad to hunt serpents. That was the mythology. Now, if you're paying attention, when I talked about Art Rentella watching this crop circle, what was the very first thing that he noticed? The bark coming off the tree. Now, the Ojibwas believed that the home of the thunderbird, from time to time, they would leave their home and they would go into different parts of the earth in search of serpents. And when they saw the thunderbolt strike a tree, these Indians believed that the thunderbird had shot its fiery arrow at a serpent and sort of missed. And this legend was ritually reenacted as part of these earth renewal ceremonies that various tribes held. Now, this is a gorget that was from Texas, dated to probably 1,500 years old or so, depicting this battle between the thunderbird and the great horned serpent, back and forth. So this mythology, these mythologies date back very, very old, and seems to be part of the cosmological tradition. So here at Serpent Mound, of course, many archaeologists have the idea that this is depicting sort of this great horned serpent in the ground. And of course, we don't really know the builders of Serpent Mound or the time frame of Serpent Mound, but there are astronomical alignments built into here. there are solstice alignments, there are lunar alignments, and that the Serpent Mound itself may be an analog to the constellation Draco, because each of the stars in the constellation Draco seem to fall along key points of the serpent. Now, Draco, of course, is the dragon in Greek mythology, so there's some serpentine mythology going along there. But back in 2003, this crop circle came down right across the street from where Serpent Mound occurred. And so let's take a look at this particular formation. Came down August 24th. This was discovered by my now wife, Delcy, who sent me an email saying, oh, there's a crop circle down here, I think. Are you interested? So we got together some people and we came down to look at it. And this is a very large geometric formation in soybeans. You can see Brush Creek right there alongside of it. Serpent Mound sits right on the top of this hill. And it sits alongside Brush Creek in between two geologic faults. There was heavy rain and a storm that came through and power outages around the area at the time that the formation came down. There may have been an eyewitness some distance away that reported seeing balls of light up in the sky in the direction of where Serpent Mound was, but she was at least eight miles away, so it's hard to make the connection of whether or not that was related or not. But that this formation seems to be in alignment with Serpent Mound up on the hill. Now you'll notice here, this is the symbol that we see in the field. And you'll notice from last night's discussion, we talked about the sort of Celtic cross design. This has that sort of incorporated in it. 1, 2, 3, 4 with a big circle in the center. So there's sort of a Celtic cross pattern in the center piece of this. But certainly we have the 4 circles on the outside of it. So here's Serpent Mound here, or Serpent Mound is right here. This is the Serpent Mound crop circle formation. And I believe that this formation is symbolically, ritually reenacting the Thunderbird legend of shooting an arrow through the head of the serpent, killing it as part of the earth renewal ceremony, because that alignment goes right through the head of Serpent Mound. And this was provided to us as an aerial mapping photo that came to us by way of Chris Seal, a friend of his, took this aerial mapping photo. Now remember, there were 4 Thunderbirds, right? So this is seemingly depicting that ritual reenactment.
So who is facilitating or sparking the ritual? That is, where is this phenomenon? Because this is the second one. You go back to Wisconsin, so there's over the last. Okay.
As part of that, I mean, you kind of stole my thunder.
Oh, well.
One of the things, if you think about Art Rentella's eyewitness formation, Art Rentella's crop circle came down at the beginning of July. And this crop circle came down near the end of August. If you remember the Thunderbird ritual, the Thunderbirds move from the northwest to the southeast in late summer. And so perhaps what we're seeing is you have the Coulterman petriform site, which is to the west of where Art Rentella saw his crop circle. And that is a depiction of the star being, or the herald of the Thunderbirds. So that, moving from west to east, you have the herald of the Thunderbirds, the thunderstorm coming past, Art Rentella seeing the crop circle come down, which is located near the Mayville Serpent Mound, right? Thunderbirds trying to shoot the serpent, kill the serpent. Then, as the Thunderbirds move through time and space to the end of the summertime, they move from northwest to the southeast and wind up at Serpent Mound. Another storm comes through, and they ritually reenact the killing of the serpent. That's what seems to be playing out. Now, if you remember how I prefaced this talk, have to think about sometimes, I think, the context of the landscape and the cultural identity of what is in the landscape around us, not just the water and the hills and the power lines and all that kind of stuff, but think about it from a different cultural perspective. Think about it from the culture that built these locations. How did they see the world? How did they view the world? How did they interpret and understand how their world worked and how they described things in the natural environment occurring? Their stories and their mythologies were their ways of explaining and interpreting the world. And this seems to hold true for us today. Even though we've discarded that as being our, not reality, what they are describing seems to be perfectly accurate explanation for what we see. It's just a different way of looking at it. So I think that that is how we should be viewing this in a sense. So if we can kind of keep going here a little bit. Former crop circle researcher, also a physicist by the name of John Burke, a couple years ago wrote this book called Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty. And he and Kaj Halberg presented some scientific findings in their book that point to the likelihood that ancient earth and stone monuments around the world were built for a very practical use of amplifying naturally occurring magnetic fields. And that they did this in order to increase crop yields in the surrounding area, a technology that only recently has been replicated by modern science by John Burke and W.C. Levengood. They took out a patent on this particular technology. Through W.C. Levengood's work on crop circles and looking at the exposure that happened to seeds inside crop circles, he found that, I described this yesterday, the accelerated growth rates, probably due to the electromagnetic fields being associated there. Burke and Levengood put together a device to mimic that amplification of electromagnetic fields that they could expose seeds to make them grow faster and make them grow better. And this seems to be replicated at these ancient sites. And so Burke and Hallberg took seeds to these ancient sites and placed them on the mounds, inside the stone circles, and they they had control samples, and they worked with the University of Florida to germinate these plants, and they found the exact same accelerated growth rates that we see with Levengood's work coming out of the crop circles. So he and Levengood got together and built a device that can mimic that. And it turns out that archaeological research shows that the mounds and the earthworks and the henges and pyramids and other ancient temple structures seem to have been built not when times were good, but when times were bad or in desperate times of famine, as if ancient peoples were building these structures to help them grow their plants better. So it was some way, Burke and Hallberg believed that it was a way that they used the technology, this ancient technology, to increase food production. That could be one of the purposes behind building some of these sites. So I talked about the same results that can be achieved there, and you duplicated one of Burke's.
As a matter of fact, after our meeting a couple of years ago, we went to the circuit mound, and some of you will remember we tried to take a group picture by the stone monument, and my camera was malfunctioning, and I thought that was quite unusual. Well, at the same time that I was doing that, I had taken corn seeds, 20 per packet, put them into little bags of felt, and left them in various places on the circuit mound and on the circuit mound site. And then later, I compared the germination of those with similar packets that were left in the car. And also, out in front of my school, I put some on the lawn in front of the school and exposed them the same way they were on the circuit mound. The bottom line is that the seeds that were at the circuit mound sprouted significantly faster than all the controls. And I did multiple controls, so it took all the variations into account.
And Burke and Hallberg actually went to Serpent Mound and did that same study, so Chuck was reproducing that study just to confirm it. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
Is it possible that they had a system tapping into the astronomical movements of the stars and the planets to generate power into? Is this what you're saying? That they somehow tapped in, I mean, there's a movement, there's an energy when the planets move around the sun,
Sure.
the whole galaxy moves. Are they somehow tapping into, with their astronomical?
Well, they may have a fundamentally different understanding. They may have a fundamentally different understanding of how things actually work than what modern science really understands things and how things work.
Where did the scientists come? That's the other way.
Well, one of the things that I hypothesize about is that some of these places naturally exist in the Earth's environment. And if you think about our modern culture, we're just absolutely immersed in electromagnetic fields, from radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts, power lines, cell phone radiation, all that stuff. That's our environment that we live in today. And so we're really desensitized to natural changes in the Earth's electromagnetic fields. But 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, and certainly thousands of years ago, they were not. And people today, dowsers for instance, can become more sensitized with training over time to, and certainly there are people that are more sensitive to electromagnetic fields than others, and they can feel those changes in the landscape. And it's my sense that a lot of the Native American mound structures were built in places that the Native Americans could feel it was actually different.
So you think it's just Earth's magnetism, not really?
Well, we really don't know for sure, and I'm not sure that we'll ever know for sure, but I think that's a good idea.
One of the things, the first thing I thought when I saw the Serpent Mound proclamation, and it ties in my opinion, to what you were saying, is that it was an asteroid. And it's a very simple sort of reproduction of an asteroid, which was the ancient way of navigating the stars in relation to the sun. And so it's sort of making sense what you just said, that this particular symbol was all, sometimes I think things are more than one thing.
Oh, there are many levels to this, and we'll go look at some more here in a second.
You know, what I'm curious is how do, or who taught the four Thunderbirds to do geometry? In other words, where are they getting it? Yeah.
Well, here's an idea. We mentioned Carl Jung previously. Carl Jung, in some of his writings, talks about that there's something in the process of that he used to do with some of his patients. He was a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and he would have patients come to him for depression and things, and he would treat them. And they would come to a turning point, and I'll actually go into this more tomorrow, but they would come to a turning point that became illuminating for the patient and transforming. And he, in the paintings that he would have his patients paint, this turning point, there was always a serpent there. And he said that the snake was a necessary part of the process of growth. Right? And so if you think about Serpent Mound as the great horned serpent, the horned serpent was this spirit being connected to curing, medicine, and mythology, and was a powerful underground monotube that was the guardian spirit of the Native Americans. Now, traditionally, in Western culture, the god of revelation took the form of the snake. It's known as the Agatho-daemon. And, or the Agatho part just means good, or the good daemon. And that it was depicted as being the Celtic cross, or a circle with encircling the equal cross. Right? Now, Agatho-daemon was, in Greek mythology, the pupil or the teacher of Hermes, or Mercurius. And to the Greeks, Mercurius was the guardian of the vines in the cornfields. Now, there's this interesting little symbol. I talked about the sort of Celtic cross pattern yesterday. Now, a friend of mine in England, a crop circle researcher, has studied this quite a bit. So let's sort of talk about that. Oh, I wanted to mention, I think I threw this slide in a little bit out of order. In the last year or so, I've really tracked down to find where the serpent mounds have been located here in the United States. And there are many of them. There wasn't just the serpent mound here up the road, but there were many, many of them. And I mentioned that you could consider Portsmouth to be sort of the great serpent, like the great apiary serpent in England. It's laid out like a serpent there. And if you continue in that direction, you start at Serpent Mound, and you go to Portsmouth, and you continue on that heading, you will hit the Kentucky stone serpent down south of Ashland, Kentucky. And if you go the opposite direction, go Kentucky stone serpent, Portsmouth serpent, Serpent Mound, and continue on the line going up the opposite way, you come to the Kern stone serpents, which are right outside Fort Ancient. And so they all appear in a right line right here. Oops, right here. But there are lots of other serpent mounds. Talked about the Mayville serpent mound. And there are some other serpent mounds up in Wisconsin. There are some serpent mounds down in here. But I want to show one other particular one. Remember I mentioned Stephen Peet locating this serpent mound up in Mayville. Well, he found another serpent mound in Quincy, Illinois, in Adams County, Illinois. We're here in Adams County, Ohio. And here is a satellite photograph of the Quincy, Illinois serpent mound. Now, remember, the great horned serpent is like the underwater serpent, underwater panther. It's associated with water, right? This was a satellite image that I came across, and Pete described this serpent as being broken up into 4 parts. Here is the open mouth, just like the open mouth here. There was the remains of something of an oval here, and then there were pieces of it, like it was broken up. Now, they didn't really understand it, and some people didn't consider this to be a serpent mound, but I do because of this. Here is another satellite photograph of it, taken at a different time. It's as if they built this serpent mound to depict the serpent actually going through water, that this area surrounding it actually retains water during certain times of the year. So this is really interesting stuff, and we're seeing this sort of being described in the landscape, really symbolically depicted. All right, now in 2003, there wasn't just the crop circle that came down outside of Serpent Mound. There were a series of crop circles that came down. The first one of the year came down in a place called Hilltop, Kentucky. Then there was the one that came down at Serpent Mound. Then there was the one that came down at Bainbridge. And then there was one that came down in West Union, Ohio. And they all fell on this sort of straight line. And we were really interested in this. This was like a new revelation to us, although back in 1996, I sort of put together a line of crop circles that occurred in Indiana, and I wondered about it back then, but between 1996 and 2003, we never saw really anything like it. And in that case, there were 3. In this case, there were 4, so that really increases the odds of this being more than just some sort of random occurrence. And also, sort of right on the line is where we are right now, is right here at Woodland Altars. That sort of fell on the line. And so this was really interesting. We'll talk a little about that as we go on. Now, the following year, in 2004, this crop circle formation came down in Miamisburg, Ohio. And you'll notice that the design of it is really similar to the crop circle formation that came down by Serpent Mound. And this was discovered by a local sheriff who was in a traffic copter, and there were no tracks leading into it, although corn's kind of easy to go in and out of, but it was so far away, nobody could see it from any road or anything like that. And it seems like it was spotted right after a fairly significant storm that came through the area. In fact, right adjacent to the front of this field is the local fire station, and that fire station got hit by lightning and it blew out their radio equipment. So this was right up there in Miamisburg. Now, of course, it happened to come down in the field closest to the Miamisburg Mountain. I mentioned that earlier, and I showed that alignment near the beginning of my talk. Gene Thomas did this for us. Did you want to quickly mention this, or are you going to mention it in your talk?
Well, Miamisburg we mentioned, but I don't think I'm talking about that specific picture. That's some of the magnetic material that was taken out of the soil.
Right.
I don't know which part of the formation.
Right. So I just wanted to show this as a depiction that there was some increased level of magnetic material found. We did authenticate this using the LNE process for node elongation. There were many anomalous lights associated with this formation saw by multiple witnesses on different times after the formation occurred. Actually, while they were in the formation, it's kind of interesting. This was about 2 weeks old by the time we got there, so we didn't really pick up any radioactivity or electromagnetic field measurement changes. Those typically dissipate after about 10 days, so we didn't pick that up. But the other things we were able to authenticate using those other tests. Now, if you compare the two formations, they seem to have the exact same components, that there are 5 parts to each of the formations, 5 circles there, and you can lay one out over the top of the other, and that's how close they really are. Now, what's interesting about this formation, too, is that it seems to incorporate fractal geometry. This repeating fractal pattern is embedded within the design or the structure of the geometry there. Now, I just want to take this as a little bit of an aside. At the same exact time that this crop circle occurred, there was the last in a series of major hurricanes that was hitting the United States. And Michael Eastlake, who is in here today, I don't see him come in, but he may be here later. His son was living in Florida, and he was really torn between going up to see this crop circle in Miamisburg and going down to help his son rebuild after the hurricane hit. And he said that he just felt that there was this really strong urge, that there was some weird connection between the hurricane and the crop circle, personally for him, certainly. And so I wrote a report about the Miamisburg crop circle, and which had happened during the time of this, and we published this photograph. And I got an email from a gentleman. These are the lines of the 4 hurricanes. This is the actual hurricane track line. And where these made landfall, I extended the lines, and they all crossed right over Miamisburg. Now that's really kind of unusual and kind of interesting. And the 4 hurricanes were Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and G. And the remains of Hurricane Francis actually made it all the way to Miamisburg, Ohio, because we actually were out there in the storms from the remnants of that hurricane actually made it all the way up into Ohio and was hitting the time that we went out to go look at the crop circle. And we actually received a report of an RDF-type crop circle from the result of that storm that occurred near Raritan, Ohio, in Schuyler County, which is not too far from here. Then I got a call or an email from this guy by the name of Buzz Buzzard, that's his nickname, from Marlantis Research in California. And he said, you have to take the crop circle, take it, orient it to north, and cut the picture in half and fold it over. So we did that. Ted Robinson did this for me and came up with that right there. And then we were really surprised when MSNBC started using that for their logo for the hurricane. That's called what? Synchronicity. So here's the Miamisburg crop circle, and it turns out that during that year, the crop circles that occurred in the state of Ohio it turns out that at the first crop circle conference that we had in the spring of 2004, a number of people got together at that conference, and we decided to, we committed to doing some test crop circle formations so that we could go out into a field, make some hoaxed circles and test them so we could measure the effects of hoaxing on plants. And we also did some sort of meditative work, a duplication of an experiment done by some researchers in England to try and meditate on a symbol to see if the symbol would show up in the field. And are you going to talk about that?
I will.
Okay, then I won't go into it. I'll let Chuck talk about that later. But the place that we were offered, one of the people that came to the conference said, you can come out to our farm and you can do the test circles. And it turned out that that's where we made our test circles. That fell on the line. And that was actually the first of the line. So, here we are, we agreed to do this at Woodland Altars, and then we made our test circles here, and then the rest of the crop circles fell down on the line. So there is a synchronicity. Now, it turns out that there was another crop circle that we didn't know about that I didn't find out until a whole year later, that if you extend the line through Ohio down into West Virginia, there was a crop circle that came down at Oakville, West Virginia. And so the crop circles continued to extend down that line across hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so in 2005, there was a whole series of crop circles that we went to investigate in North Carolina that I won't go into. But we went down to this first crop circle right here, and there had been one previously right here, and it was literally on the drive down there that I got this report of this crop circle that had happened the previous year in West Virginia. And so when I got down there and I arrived, I put them on the map and I said, oh boy, looks like there might be a line connection here. So we convinced a friend of ours that we met down there, a pilot, to fly the line. And when we flew the line, we discovered more crop circles on the line that had not been reported previously. And so this was the line, and it connected up to Oakville, West Virginia, and it made this 90-degree bend. The two lines connected. So here is sort of a larger view of that. Here is the 2004 line and the 2005 line. And Jim is going to talk about this in his talk. He's going to talk about the significance of this. But it appears to be known as something known as the Great Cross of North America. It's two arms of the Great Cross of North America. And so this seems to be being played out by where the crop circles are coming down in the landscape. And just so you can see, there is the original 2003 line that we looked at.
Where would Madison go?
Not on either one.
Not on either one.
Now, I mentioned near the beginning of my talk, I mentioned the alignment of the crop circle at Miamisburg to the Miamisburg Mound. And for a long time, we were under the assumption that it went sort of adjacent to one side of the mound, on the south side of the mound. But recently, Google has uploaded a new satellite image, which was taken in the early springtime, probably around February or March. I think it was probably in February of 2005, after the crop circle had been harvested and before anything started growing up the following year. And so you can just see, and this is hard to see here, but you can just see the remnants of the formation here. And so I threw down a line on the wider Google map to see what the actual alignment is, and it goes right through the center of the mound. It doesn't go adjacent to the mound itself. So it goes actually right through the center of Miamisburg Mound. Again, it's the closest field left to where the mound occurred. Now, if I could just go back to that image real quick, who in here is really familiar with the formation, this crop circle formation? Anybody? at this alignment right here. Should I prompt you or not? You don't get it, okay. This crop circle, there was a series of circles, right? Everybody saw that when I compared the two formations. There's one circle at the top here, which was actually offset a little bit. It's right here. It's offset off of the alignment of all the rest of them. And we really wondered about that for a long time. Tried to understand, well, why is that one circle offset? I think I may have the answer to that when we get to that in a little bit. So we'll sort of prime you. Where does that offset line go? Goes off through this circle right here. Anybody want to take a guess? What's that? That's a good guess. That's not where it goes. It goes to Bainbridge. This is the 2004 line that went through the area near Superman where those crop circles all fell down. The offset line goes to the crop circle formation in Bainbridge. Not just to Bainbridge, but it actually hits the formation dead on. This is the Google image with the aerial mapping overlay of that Chris Steele took of the Google image. It actually hits that dead on. And this is the 2003 line right up to the image, to the crop circle, and it makes a 90-degree bend.
So the green one is 2000.
This is the offset line. This is the 2003 crop circle line.
And what was the year again for the Miamisburg?
2004.
So you go 304,
Right.
5.
So let's talk about the Bainbridge crop circle because we haven't mentioned it at this
You
stage.
just walked out.
She just walked out. Well, you're here. You can listen. All right. This is the formation that came down in September of 2003. This happened on an island in the Paint Creek, and there were no tram lines into the formation. There were no tracks leading in. It was not visible from any road around. And so this is kind of what it looked like from the ground. When we arrived at the formation, you can see Doug McWayne right there. We're looking at the circle on the end of it. You can see all this standing water in the formation. It was actually 1/3 of the formation was so filled with water it would go up to your about just below your knee. That's how deep the water was inside the crop circle. And so I was actually the very first one to get into the formation. The landowner refused to believe they even had it on his property. Nobody had been out there. We convinced him it was there, showed him an aerial photograph, said, this is what's out there, you know, can we go out and look at it? We went out there, so we were the first ones there. Now, later on we learned that the landowner of the formation said that one particular night before he discovered the formation, he actually learned about it, that he used to fly his plane and landed on this grass strip. And one day, he was coming home from work in the afternoon. He's a cancer researcher, and he was coming back from some kind of conference, and he landed his plane here and drove back home. His house is right over here. And that night, he was sitting on his back porch in his hot tub, and he heard this weird sound coming from the area of where the crop circle was occurring. He said it was a low pitch, almost like a hum or a mechanical sound. Never changed pitch, never changed intensity. Heard it for like an hour or two. Thought maybe I'd go out there and look at it, but he was too comfy in his hot tub, so he never decided to go out there. Decided not to go out and look at it. And it turns out that another neighbor down the road heard the same thing. And so there seems to be this association with the hum, because the very next day, he got back in his plane, flew over the island, and the formation was there. So kind of interesting. Now, when we arrived in there, we spent a bunch of time mapping this whole thing out, got the GPS out, mapping the whole thing out, and then, as I mentioned last night, my GPS, actually when I got done and finished taking all the readings and I turned it off, it actually began to glow in my hand and it fried the electronics out. So that was sort of a side thing. And then right after that happened, we went back home to Michigan, and I got a call from the mayor of Bainbridge saying, can you come down and look, we got a crop circle down here, can you come down and investigate it? I said, well, actually, we've already been there. So they were a little late on the draw, but Rocky was pretty nice. That's her name, Rocky.
Jack, what
Yeah.
day was the hunt? Do you have a date?
Didn't have an exact date, but he believed that it was around the time that the Serpent Mound crop circle formation came down. Because it wasn't too long after that the news of that one broke, and he remembered that one. So we don't have an exact date, but we're pegging it to end of August, beginning of September. The date that we went down is the date that we recorded there, September 25th. So the formation was discovered by a pilot by the name of Dan Music. Dan Music was the pilot that took us flying over the Serpent Mound crop circle formation and to fly over a Hooks crop circle formation. And he, after us showing him those, then he knew what crop circles were, and he happened to spot this one. And so he called us up, and like I said, the formation wasn't seen from any road. The island is completely surrounded by trees. And what's interesting is that the interior edges of the formation, the plants themselves, had this really red discoloration, and I showed a photo of that last night. That's produced by anthocyanin, or stresses within the plant. That happens typically in the fall colors. But this happened when the plants were green, and that anthocyanin seems to be produced by whatever is making the crop circles. We found that in several formations now. And that sort of, we talked to some farmers about that, and they call that windburn. But they usually find that along the edges of the plants. They find that on plants on the edges of fields that are exposed to wind because they're stressed. This is on the inside of the field, on the inside edges of the formation. We found that. So the formation's geometry is pretty exquisite, and it's what I call harmonically balanced. This was a depiction of that was done by Bert Jansen, who I mentioned earlier, who was a geometer in the Netherlands, who said that he wrote a book recently on crop circles called The Hypnotic Power of Crop Circles. And he has spent 10 or 15 years looking at crop circles and studying their geometry specifically. And he said, in his book, at the very end of his book, he has a section where he writes that this was one of the most favorite crop circles he has ever worked on and has ever seen, because all of the geometry lessons that he has learned from crop circles over the years seem to be combined into one, into this formation. All of the different geometric lessons were applied to make this particular crop circle. So I did my own little study in terms of what I call harmonically balanced. So pay attention here. What you're going to see is the relationship of the similar sizes of circles and why I consider this to be harmonically balanced. There are a number of similar sized circles that are in here, and so you'll see what that relationship is and how it forms together. So these circles are all the same, and of course, they match those. And then you have these circles, and then you have these circles, and so when you combine them all, you see how it's almost like ripples in a pond that creates this particular formation. And there's the triangle. Right? So it's what I call, it's balanced geometrically or harmonically balanced. So one of the things that we tried to do is we tried to look at this from this Native American perspective and try to understand what these symbols are from that particular perspective. And it's taken me a long time to try and figure some of this out, because a lot of these references are pretty obscure. But I found in a a book by W.J. Hoffman called The Picture Writing of the American Indians, which was published by the Smithsonian Institution in the 1800s, that there was a symbol of a circle with a ring around it with an arm attached to it that was found on one of the Megamine Grand Medicine Society birch bark scrolls. And that the Megamine translated that to mean that which I live upon has been put on this dish by the spirit. That's what that symbol meant to the Megamine. Now the triangle is interesting. The earliest Native American reference to the triangle was by Lejeune, who was one of the French explorers. In 1634 was told by a Gissikid. Now Gissikid is another of the secret societies of the Ojibwa, like the Megamine. He was told by a Gissikid that the triangles were symbols of air spirits and an indicator of the source of life. And then, of course, this is shown in many, many cases on petroglyphs as the Thunderbird. This is an actual depiction of the Thunderbird form. It's drawn by a number of Native American spirits. The earliest reference I found was by Garrett Mallory in 1888. So this may be getting some glimmer of what's going on at Bainbridge. Now, sure.
I was doing some research on the internet, and there's a ladies group that actually uses that symbol for earth, sky, and water.
So that the traditional sort of
Right.
platonic
Yeah.
states of matter.
Right.
Okay, here's the crop circle formation. There's the overlay. We got where the formation is, and it is dead on alignment with Site Mound. There's the original overlay there. The mound is right in the center, and it actually hits the mound dead on. And it does so right through the triangle. Now, let me go back to this real quick. There was another crop circle formation that occurred right here in the year 2000. So earlier than the 2003 formation. This is what it looked like. This is the aerial of it after it had been harvested. It was 3 circles, 2 with rings around it, and there were a couple of ground shots. And of course, this is very close to Serpent Mound. There's a Site Mound. There's an aerial image of it. You can just see a hint of the exterior earthwork that's mostly obliterated. That was a shot that I took. So let's talk a little bit about Site Mound. This is a geometric complex of earthworks built around 100 AD. That's about the carbon dating of it. And occupied at least through 450 AD. That's the last carbon date of it. It was built by the so-called Hopewell culture using standard units of measure, that they had their seemingly own standard unit of measure, and that there are artifacts that were found in this complex. I mentioned some of that last night, that were found in Tennessee at Ice House Bottom, that the pottery shards that they found at Ice House Bottom came from Site Mound, and that Site Mound had pottery shards that came from Ice House Bottom. There were also pipes that were found in Site Mound that seemed to come from the exchange from those cultures. There were some obsidian blades that were found that came from Wyoming. There was mica that was found from North Carolina. There was copper that was found from Michigan. This was an extensive ceremonial site that was traded widely. And you can see some of the geometry here. This square is the same as this square. This circle is proportional to this circle. But this is the interesting thing. I want to spend a little bit of time about this. Let's think about the Hopewell cosmology that I described. The 3 levels of that cosmology, right? You had the upper sky world, the middle world, and the lower underworld. This is a 3D model that was made of Site Mound a number of years ago. And you'll notice that there are 3 levels that this was built on. And I found a number of references in a number of Native American myths that talk about the people went to the square ground to visit the snake priest. And there are a number of references to the Thunderbird and the circle as being part of the sky world. All right? So if we think about this, this is the lowest level down here, right? This is the higher level than this here. And then there's this level combination, the place where those two converge and merge is where this central mound feature was. And when that mound was excavated, they found the remains of a ceremonial building. And the building was in two parts that was connected by a passageway. Almost as if that there were two different rituals combining within that ceremonial structure in the center of that mound. That is sort of ritually depicting that landscape that we see here, the three levels of the cosmology. What's that?
Heaven and earth meeting.
Yes, it's where we reside on our plane of existence. It's the place where those two things can combine. So they were interfacing with those two spirit worlds, above and below, at that central point. And that's where, of course, the crop circle is lining to that central point right here. Now here is some of the geometry inherent in this. You'll notice that this circle here is the same as the circle that fits inside of this cross pattern of mounds. And that, of course, this square here is the same as this square here, which bisects the central mound in the middle. And then there are all of these interesting alignments of mounds around and inside of the formation of this geometric earthwork. So there is a lot more going on at Site Mound than what we really understand today. But the main feature that we want to look at is this combination of the circle and the squares. That was the place sort of where they could interact with the upper world and the lower world. Those three levels of cosmology. And you can see that the triangle actually points right at it. It pointed in that direction and it hit that mound dead on. All right? Now, for years and years and years, people have been pestering me to say, okay, we have this third symbol here. Where does that point? We have a third symbol, the Thunderbird, right? This points up in this direction, right? The other two directions are really parallel to these lines. This line points that way, this line points that way, and they're parallel. So we know that they go in these directions. But this third line, anybody want to take a guess? This line right here. Here's a bit of an extension of it, so it's going off in this direction.
The one that goes through all those mountains.
Here's the wider map. Goes off through this direction.
Towards Wisconsin.
Can you read that? Paulding, Ohio. 4th of July, 1996.
Wow.
The very first crop circle that I went to, that Chris Steele went to, that Roger went to, that Chuck went to. And not only does it hit that crop circle, it hits it dead on in the field itself. It's not close, it's not nearby. It hits that field right where the crop circle occurred, dead on.
If it goes further, or will it?
Oh, I'm sure it does. I mean, we could extend those lines all over the place. What's that? I don't think so. I don't believe it does. That Michigan mound would be much farther to the east.
Any evidence of mounds or archaeology in Paulding?
There's very little known about the Paulding County area in terms of Native American culture. And what we do know is that it was part of the Black Swamp. At one point it was drained away in the pioneer days. So there wasn't a lot of Native American activity in the Black Swamps, or the Great Swamp that was up there. But there are a few scattered references, but I really don't know a whole lot about the Paulding area.
And is there any relationship of that one of the Bainbridge to the Wisconsin? Is there any connection there?
Not that I know of at this point.
And just a quick review in terms of dates. July 4th, 1996.
July 4th, 2003.
2003, that was,
The formation of Wisconsin.
right, okay, so Mayville. And then also 2003, great
August 25th, is Silver Mound.
25th,
And we don't know the exact dating for Bainbridge, but maybe the same day.
okay, so.
The power of trance is connected to the power of the Thunderbird. And as a paradoxical state of consciousness, it ties into this paradoxical energy of thunder and lightning. And he says it's in such paradoxical states that people often may assimilate new information quickly without filtering. If you think about the relationship with crop circles, that's really how we are getting this information in a similar sense. So the Native American elder Distant Eagle says this about the thunder beings. They are the guardians of truth. Remember this, when the rain and wind lash your face, when you see a flash of lightning, when you hear the voice of thunder, when your home is shaking, they are there. When they are there, shut up and listen to them. But But even when you don't observe these manifestations of their presence, bear in mind that they are never far from us and can hear us, even our thoughts, especially when they are silent themselves. So be truthful, be good, be generous, be humble, be respectful. Nobody carries Thunderbird medicine. No, never claim any connection with them, as they do not take kindly to that and never are to be trifled with. When you are sure that they aren't there, they come full force. They are beyond good and evil. They are cleansers, and they cleanse away everything, good and evil. That is to say, they lead to new beginnings.